Now we get into our first Electrode archetype, the OG Electrode archetype, BuzZapdos. Of course, centering first and foremost around base set Electrode and its BuzZap Pokemon power, which would allow you to KO Electrode yourself, allowing your opponent to take a prize, but in return you get to attach Electrode to one of your other Pokemon as an energy card that provides 2 of any type of energy that you specify. So if you use BuzZap and knock out your Electrode and say Fighting Energy, it becomes a double Fighting Energy that you can attach to a Machamp or whatever deck you're running. Because with the speed and energy efficiency of a lot of other cards in base set, it really pushed these high energy cost Pokemon over to the side until people started to figure out that, oh, actually you can speed these decks up really fast with Electrode. And you can kind of run the cost-benefit analysis in your head and going like, yes, I'll allow my opponent to take a prize by knocking Electrode out, but if that allows me to start attacking with a very heavy-hitting Pokemon 1 or 2 turns earlier than my opponent may be expecting, then I'm going to be able to get 2 or maybe 3 knockouts in exchange. The most commonly paired card was, of course, base set Zapdos. A 90 HP basic, pretty solid. A very powerful card with attacks that deal 60 damage and 100 damage, but eyeballing those energy costs, you're going, well, they're not worth taking 4 turns to build up to get to either of those attacks. Zapdos would most likely be knocked out within 4 turns. But when you factor in Electrode, and you go, okay, well, if I sacrifice Electrode, let my opponent take a prize, I can actually deal 60 damage or 100 damage on turn 2. 60 damage is going to be enough to OHKO the majority of basic Pokemon in base set. You do have your 70 HP Haymaker cards, but that's why the deck runs plus power. And then with Thunderbolt, that's going to be able to OHKO any Pokemon in base set that isn't named Charizard or Chansey. So running that cost-benefit analysis in your head, you're probably already thinking, okay, yeah, for that one sacrificed Electrode, I could get at least 2 knockouts. Maybe even more, considering that Zapdos does have 90 HP, a fighting resistance, and no weakness. All you have to do is build up the trainer support around it. So let's take a look at that trainer support. Starting the deck list with a full playset of Voltorb, it's going to be very crucial to get a Voltorb down on the bench as soon as possible. Ideally turn 1, which is not only going to help protect it from attacks, but it's also going to mean that you can draw an Electrode on turn 2, evolve that Voltorb straight away, go ahead and convert that Electrode into an energy card, and be 2 energy up on your active Pokemon, while also making sure that Electrode's not sitting on your bench being a liability. 9 times out of 10, you are going to use BuzZap as soon as you evolve up from Voltorb. So given the ideal setup, you'll have a Zapdos in the active position and a Voltorb on the bench to start the game. Turn 1, attach your energy per turn to Zapdos. Turn 2, attach your energy per turn to Zapdos for energy number 2. Evolve that Voltorb on your bench into an Electrode. Attach it as a double lightning energy to Zapdos and start dealing lots and lots of damage. We got a full playset of base set Zapdos in this deck with a couple copies of Doduo as well. The Doduo is in here for when you don't get that perfect setup. Like I've talked about in other decks, Doduo is a great utility card for just sponging up a little bit of damage and then using that free retreat once you're ready, once you do have a more solid setup, to then bring out that Zapdos. Because while this deck can be consistently fast and powerful, that doesn't mean that you're not going to run into snags. This deck can also get torn down pretty quickly if your opponent ends up with a lot of energy removals in their hands. That is the number one weakness of this deck, is that you can sacrifice an Electrode, your opponent takes a prize, and then they just discard it with an energy removal. So it's those types of situations you kind of have to pull back, bring up that Doduo, let it do its thing for a couple turns while you get a couple more energy attached to Zapdos, get another Voltorb evolved up. For our trainer draw power, we got a full playset of Bill and then 3 copies of Professor Oak. Again, Oak's one of those kind of just like once or twice per game as needed kind of things. But because it is base set only, I'm running a full playset of Maintenance. A card that is often forgotten, but it's a great card for helping you avoid deck outs, and a great source of draw power for decks that are a lot more laser focused in their goal, like this deck, For instance, you're not always going to need a Doduo. You're not always going to need a plus power or a defender. Those are very situational cards, but if you've got a loaded hand with a bunch of those in it, you can just use maintenance to put those back in your deck, save them for a little bit later, go ahead and draw an extra card and see if you can actually get what you need. Because when it does come to cards like plus power or defender, you don't want to have those in your discard when you need them. Instead, it's better to just shuffle them back into your deck, hope that you don't redraw them anytime soon, and hope that you are able to draw something more useful for the moment. 3 copies of Computer Search and 2 copies of Pokemon Trader to make it more likely that you're going to be able to get those Electrodes on turn 2 when you need them most. 3 copies of Last. You could even bump this up to 4 if you need to, since it is so crucial to keep energy removals out of your opponent's hand in order to keep the momentum for this deck moving. Full set of plus power for those scenarios when you need to deal 70 damage. If you're up against Electabuzz, Hitmonchan. Because this deck is a little bit fragile energy-wise, it is important to get OHKOs every single time possible. So even if you're up against like an 80 HP Pokemon like a Machoke or a Charmeleon or something, it's still pretty important to try to get those 2 plus powers, because adding an extra turn means your opponent has an extra turn to try to discard the Electrode off or to deal more damage to Zapdos. And you want to keep Zapdos alive as long as possible. I mean, Electrode made a sacrifice for a reason. You got to carry on Electrode's will, which is why there's also a playset of Defender in this deck. For any time that you're using Zapdos' Thunder attack, you're dealing 30 damage to yourself, but if you attach a Defender before you attack, it's also going to prevent self-damage, so Zapdos will only be dealing 10 damage to itself instead of 30, and then also on your opponent's next turn, any damage that they deal to you will also be reduced by 20. Got a couple copies of Gust of Wind in this deck. Even though I said it's imperative to get as many OHKOs as possible, with 4 energy loaded onto a Zapdos, there's not a whole lot of situations where you're not going to be able to get that OHKO. Because, yeah, say your opponent's active has 80 HP. You don't have the plus powers left over. You can still hit it with a Thunderbolt. It's just going to take more time to recover. And a lot of times that's the choice you have to make is, do I sacrifice all of these energy to get the OHKO, or do I risk it and try to make it a 2-turn knockout, giving my opponent a lot more wiggle room to move around and actually deprive me of prizes? 3 copies of Item Finder so you can recycle some very important trainers like Defender or Last, and then 2 copies of Energy Retrieval to make sure that your basic energy cards are staying in your hand, because sometimes you're going to be left with the only option being load up Zapdos with basic energy. And though not as powerful, you can still attack with Electrode. There's plenty of lightning energy in this deck to power up that attack too. So, you know, the basic energy gives you a little bit of room, but it's not the point of the deck. So yes, this deck really hates energy removal. Energy removal makes it hard to run this deck, but there is a reason that it was a popular archetype. And that's because it had a great matchup against Blastoise, which it could OHKO no problem. Even Gyarados didn't really pose a whole lot of a threat because you could Thunderbolt it and OHKO a Gyarados as well. And it had a great matchup against Haymaker because it could deal a lot more damage early on than Haymaker could really dream about. BuzZapdos is more of a donk deck rather than Haymaker, so knockout per knockout, BuzZapdos actually moves a lot faster than Haymaker does the majority of the time. And sticking Hitmonchans and Electabuzzes in the discard that early in the game can really derail a Haymaker deck. Zapdos also matches up very well against Damage Swap just because it deals damage too quickly for Damage Swap to keep up with, which is ironic because the reason that BuzZapdos didn't see much play in the base fossil format, including 3 sets, is because of Mr. Mime, a later staple of Damage Swap. Jungle really introduced several cards that really destroyed BuzZapdos' viability. The other ones being Lickitung and Kangaskhan, which were high HP basic Pokemon that would require you to use up 2 turns in order to knock them out, which slowed this deck down so much that it made it pointless to play. And of course Wigglytuff, which could deal huge amounts of damage on turn 2 without having to sacrifice any Electrodes. And that's going to be it for the rundown of base set only BuzZapdos. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Let me know what your favorite base set era cards are. Thank you so much for watching the video and continuing to like and comment, supporting the channel. It's very much appreciated. Social media links in the description. I'll see you next video. Bye.